Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. These words in Matthew 28:19 of the Bible have put a conviction in the hearts of Christian people of all ethnicities, backgrounds, and languages. Many have taken this call very seriously. Missionary work by Americans both inside and outside of the United States has had a profound effect on the Christian heritage of America. Missions can lead to unforeseeable and sometimes dangerous circumstances. One of the most well-known American missionaries was Jim Elliot. The life, death, and now legacy of Jim Elliot, enhanced by his wife Elisabeth Elliot, had a profound effect and influence on America, Christians, and the future of missions. His death, as well as the other missionaries with him, created a legacy and a fascination due in part to the continued work by his wife Elisabeth. Jim Elliot, along with 4 other missionaries, began reaching out to the Huaorani tribe in Ecuador in 1955. Through several months of keeping at a distance, they made a friendly encounter. However, on January 8, 1956, their visit was met with a group of warriors that killed all 5 missionaries. The story of Jim Elliot and the other missionaries did not end, though, with their deaths. Now, in researching and describing the impact of a person's life, like Jim and Elisabeth Elliot, it is important to look at different people's views in different times when their lives and the significance of their lives have been assessed. To give a baseline for their beliefs, their character, personal journals, family letters, close friend stories have to be researched. To construct a pattern of influence, newspapers, journal articles, and other media outlets become very significant as well. Much of what we know about Jim Elliot was written by his wife Elisabeth Elliot, or even written by himself. Elizabeth Elliot describes the early life of Jim in her book Shadow of the Almighty. Jim Elliot was born in 1927 to parents Fred and Clara Elliot in Portland, Oregon. Elliot came to know the Lord at the age of 6, continuing to be part of a Christian home that was constantly open to missionaries. He entered into Wheaton College in Illinois in 1945. It was well known there that he spoke freely of his faith in God. It was also there that he would meet his future wife Elisabeth, whom he would get to know and correspond with through the next several years. Elliot's heart and purpose is shown clearly in the letters that he wrote back and forth with his family. Jim felt a personal implication to preach the gospel. He soon began planning to go to the mission field, first hitchhiking his way to Mexico in the summer of 1947. Then in the summer of 1948, he traveled as part of a gospel team through the Midwestern states. At the end of 1948, Elliot attended the International Student Missionary Convention. He felt confirmed afterwards that he was called to work with the tribes in the South American jungles, but first wanted to graduate and did so with the highest honors. Jim Elliot applied and was accepted into Camp Wycliffe, a camp in Oklahoma conducted by the Summer Institute of Linguistics. It was here that he practiced his language skills in preparation for his work in South America. He studied under a former missionary to the tribes in the jungles of Ecuador. After hearing about the specific tribe, a group known there as the Aucas, that was nearly untouched by civilization, Elliot decided that was his calling. Although he had been thinking about India as well, Elliot set aside 10 days to pray for direction, confirming he was to go to Ecuador. Elliot did not go immediately. He left for Ecuador in February of 1952. Elisabeth soon followed, taking up residence across the street from him. They eventually married in October of 1953. They had first been stationed in Quito, but would eventually move towards the jungles to the Shandia mission station. They would then have a daughter, Valerie, in February of 1955. In September 1955, 2 other missionaries stationed there as well, Ed McCauley and Nate Saint, shared the news that they had spotted Auca houses from Nate's plane. This is where Operation Auca began. Although Elliot writes about Operation Auca in numerous books, much of what she wrote was before the full story was truly known. Catherine Long and Carolyn Nystrom do an excellent work of combining all of the first-hand accounts, interviews, into a depiction of what happened in their article, Martyrs to the Spear. The Aucas, as they are referred to in Elliot's book as well as numerous articles, were known for being a fierce tribe that killed for sport. After the men had found the Aucas' location, the 5 missionaries, including Jim Elliot, began taking Nate Saint's plane up and dropping gifts to the Aucas, hoping to establish a friendly relationship with them. They did this several times, calling out that they were friends to them on a loudspeaker. They continued to plan to eventually meet the Aucas. The men landed on the beach near the tribe's home in early January. On January 6th, They encountered 2 women and a man from the tribe, establishing a friendly encounter at that point. Saint even took the man up for a ride in his plane. On January 8th, a group of Aucas came to the beach site where the missionaries were, and it was on that day that Jim Elliot and the other 4 missionaries were speared by the Aucas and killed. The men and their belongings were thrown into the river. Now, what was not known at the time was why, but it was later discovered through Steve Saint, who was Nate Saint's son. He made contact with the Aucas sometime later and learned that a conflict had occurred between the group that had come to the beach a few days before and a member of that spearing party. A conflict had occurred between the man that wanted to marry one of the women and her brother, and to deflect the conflict, the group had claimed that the missionaries had attacked them. Most of the immediate aftermath is described in Elisabeth Elliot's book, Through the Gates of Splendor. With not receiving once promised radio contact from the men, their wives knew something was wrong. The next day, a friend of Saint's flew out looking for the men discovering the plane. The United States Air Rescue Service began looking, and a ground party was sent out that eventually discovered the bodies Wednesday, January 11th. 2 more men were discovered the next day, and by January 13th, the men had been identified as the missionaries. They were then buried the 14th at the beach due to a tropical storm. As news broke, the women received hundreds of letters in support and encouragement. Elliot writes about how the news spread so quickly in her book. To many people's amazements, plans were quickly being formulated to continue the work of the martyred men. There were a number of news reports on the men in Ecuador. Several newspapers even ran stories once it had been reported that the men had not returned home or been heard from. On January 11th, the Sun reported that 5 American missionaries were feared held by the Jungle Tribe. This report stated that the Air Force had found the plane destroyed and one identified body had been found. The Washington Post and the Times-Herald ran a report on the same day entitled "Churchmen Feared Slain by Savages of the Amazon." It too reported the plane and the unidentified body. Both reports gave a summary of the men's purpose in going there as missionaries, and then by January 13th, reports were breaking that the rest of the bodies of the men had been found. The Sun reported this in their article, "Bodies of the 4 Missionaries Reported Found in Ecuador." The report includes quotes from Peter Fleming's journal, one of the missionaries that was there, with information about their contact with the Aucas. Once again, the article describes the purpose of the men having gone to Ecuador. The nation, both Christians and non-Christians, were getting to hear the story of Jim Elliot and the other missionaries. Newspapers across the country were reaching out to their readers about what had happened. The story and legacy did not stop there, though. Elisabeth Elliot, Jim Elliot's wife, is one of the most significant reasons as to why his legacy became so known. In the epilogue of Elliot's book, Through the Gates of Splendor, she's writing just a few miles away from where her husband was killed and just a few feet away from the men who had killed him. Elisabeth Elliot went back to live with the tribe in 1958. She continued the work of her husband, which amazed many in the United States, both Christians and non-Christians. The Sun even published an article, "Kin of Slain Missionaries Living with Fierce Aucas," in October of 1958. The article describes once again the death of the missionaries and how Elizabeth, as well as Nate Saint's sister, were living with the tribe. Other newspaper articles would soon follow, publicizing the story of the men once again, and now the return of the women. Christianity Today published an article in 1992 entitled, "Jim Elliot's Legacy Continues." The article describes the work that has continued with the translating of the New Testament into the Waorani, the Aucas language. This was a continuation of both Jim and Elisabeth Elliot's work in Ecuador. Then Susan Dominus wrote an article in the New York Times Magazine entitled "Leaps of Faith." This was just published in 2015. The article focuses more on the work of Elisabeth Elliot continuing the legacy of her husband, mentioning that after her husband had died, was murdered, she went back to work with the tribe. It mentions that she may have helped them break a cycle of violent vendettas. Her faithfulness, which was also written for millions to read in her books, inspired many Christian women in the United States. Catherine Long and Carolyn Nystrom wrote an article, Martyrs to the Spear, mentioned earlier. They wrote about how the story quickly spread throughout America and even circled the globe. Although an estimated 26 million people died in the 20th century for their faith, only a few have been publicized, celebrated, written about, and even had a movie created for. They note that Life magazine sent someone to the scene when the men had died. Reader's Digest had even picked up the story and published journal entries that the men had written. They also talk about other missionaries that have said the death and legacy of Jim Elliot or the others influenced their decision to go into the mission field. Many were also inspired by the faith and commitment of Elisabeth Elliot. Numerous magazines ran articles on her as well as the other wives. Their courageousness and devotion to God inspired many. Elliot and the other missionaries' sacrifice not only continued to leave a legacy in America, but it also left a legacy in Ecuador. Clint Rainey wrote an article, Five Man Legacy, describing a weekend of remembrance for the killing of Elliot and the other missionaries in Ecuador. He describes how the work of Elliot continued to open a door to Ecuador, and it inspired many other American missionaries to come. Dana Roberts' article, The Influence of American Missionary Women on the World Back Home, describes the phenomenon and fascination with the American martyrs, as she calls them, not only after their deaths, but also after Elliot's book on the events was published. People were blown away by the lives of Jim and Elisabeth Elliot. Robert even states that the situation became a catalyst of people's spiritual lives and a tool of missionary recruitment. One person who was inspired by what happened was very close to the situation, and that was Steve Saint, Nate Saint's son. In his article entitled, Did They Have to Die?, Nate focuses also on the effect of the men's deaths. After describing what had happened to the 5 men, he wrote that he believes God took them in for his glory, that their work, obedience, and faith would create a legacy and inspire other Americans. Another writer close to the story, David M. Howard Jr., nephew to Elisabeth Elliot, wrote in his article entitled Triumph from Tragedy, how the death of Jim Elliot was not the end of the story. Elisabeth carried out the legacy by continuing to work with the Waorani. Jim's faith inspired many, but also Elisabeth did as well. Many Americans saw their situation as one of the most selfless acts of love. Oxenreider's article, Acts of Faith, describes how the lives of the Elliots personally affected her life. She read many of Elisabeth Elliot's book, including Through the Gates of Splendor. Reading of the faith and sacrifice of Jim Elliot was astounding to her, and even more impactful for her was the courage of Elisabeth as she continued his missionary work. She writes, by her willingness to open her heart and process grief through writing, we were given a smattering of peace to trust God for provision. Jim Elliot challenged people in his life and in his death. David M. Howard, his brother-in-law and friend, wrote about Jim in his article, My Pilgrimage and Mission. He writes about how Jim challenged people spiritually. He would push students in college, organize prayer chains, and join mission groups. He also challenged people in his death. His selfless love for people he didn't even know spoke volumes to not only those around him, but to millions of Americans and others around the globe. Elisabeth Elliot died June 15, 2015. Sam Roberts of the New York Times wrote an article about her. In his article, Elisabeth Elliot, in the Face of Tragedy, dies at 88. Roberts once again describes the story of Jim Elliot and the other missionaries. He writes of her continuation in the mission field in Ecuador, and it is clear the Elliot story is still well remembered over 50 years later. The majority of the scholarship about Jim Elliot is from a Christian perspective. There are far fewer sources from the secular realm about Jim Elliot and his influence in America. Influence and impact in general are sometimes difficult to research, as personal testimonies and stories can't be calculated. However, it is clear that the dozens of newspaper articles after the death of Jim Elliot and the books, the articles written about him and Elisabeth, their story went not only nationwide but also worldwide. What is even more astounding is the range of years that took place. From just the days after his death to over 50 years after his death, his name and legacy are still widely known and written about in America. His wife Elisabeth clearly made an impact and furthered his legacy as well. It would be interesting, in fact, to be able to poll or even interview Christians of 2018 to see how well known they are today. Some may see their death as evidence of religion's effect on a person's sanity. Now, many secular historians out there may view it as a religion's ultimate hold on a person to lose their life. Many even may call it radical. There was very little negative words said on the matter of Jim Elliot and his wife. Even the secular newspapers and journals were very positive about what they said of him. Some people saw what happened as a tragedy, and some people saw it as a triumph because of what happened after. Jim Elliot's death and the continuation of his story through his wife touched millions of Americans, both Christians and non-Christians. Their story touched missionaries' hearts and even inspired more to join the mission field. Their legacy continues, and they are forever remembered in the history of American Christianity.